Hey to all Metal Maniac, welcome to another video on Iron Horde channel. In the last few weeks I was publishing videos containing reviews of bands from particular subgenre or particular geographic area. After doing a video on the new wave of British heavy metal, on US power metal, on metal from the Scandinavian countries, all of them from the 80s decade, this time round I'm going a bit more to the south, to another country that has given us some great albums and some great bands along the years, especially again in the 80s decade, which is my favorite decade. Precisely, we're moving down to France, so prepare your baguettes, croissant, red wine, and let's go straight to the French country to see which albums really made the history in this country with regards to heavy metal. Thanks for joining us again for this video. If you're new here, our job is to review albums, support bands, promote bands, review festivals, talk about cultural aspects of heavy metal. So if this content is what you are interested in, please consider subscribing, liking and sharing our content. Now let's get back to the French heavy metal scene from the 1980s, and basically my introduction to this scene was through a particular band which I will be mentioning later on in the list of albums I have prepared for you. Basically this band opened a whole new picture on the heavy metal from the French countries. From then onwards it was a journey discovering one band after another, one album after the other, and I am up to this day very impressed with the amount of bands that came out from France and the quality more than the numbers, because in the end that is what is important, the quality, not having hundreds of bands but neither of them has left any mark whatsoever on the heavy metal scene. Sometimes people ask me, and even recently, but yes, French, English, Spanish, Italian, US scene, in the end it's all heavy metal. In essence, that is the correct way to approach such a thing, but in reality art is an expression of the feelings we have inside. So the feelings that we have inside of us are affected by our surroundings. There's no denying that. It's our nature. We are affected by everything that happens around us from our childhood to our youth and adulthood. So it is a normal progression that then the art we are producing is representation of everything that we have lived through. And obviously each of these countries has its own culture, its own characteristics, and it is normal that the art, in this case the music and heavy metal, is a representation of each culture of that country. And there are certain characteristics which are synonymous with particular countries, as you have seen from previous videos I made depicting metal from particular country, and France is no exception. Something associated with the French scene is that mystic aura which most of the time I associate with the Italian scene, mainly the Italian doom metal scene. And within a certain extent there's also in the French heavy metal scene this kind of maybe it's a Mediterranean thing, could be, because I think these kinds of expressions derive from certain religious attitudes and religious upbringing, and obviously Mediterranean countries are culturally more attached to religious values and rituals. So it's a normal thing that France and Italy, being so near each other, they have certain characteristics which are similar. And I think French bands, some of them in this list more than others, exhibit those kind of mystic aura, like a mysterious kind of approach, kind of ritualistic to a certain extent as well. It's not easy to explain these kind of feelings in the music, but once you listen to it, if you are sensitive to this kind of sound, you will immediately understand to what I'm referring to. Anyways, let's go straight to the first band on this list. I like to make a premise first and foremost that the French language is not something I excel in, and there might be some problems with pronouncing correctly the names of the bands, or mainly the names of the albums or tracks in this list. The first band on this list is the band that I have discovered last from all the bands. I'm not putting it in the last place, or actually I have to say that the ranking in this list is not really that fixed, although possibly the last four I will speak about are the four that are my favorites from this scene, but the rest of the rankings is not really, don't really pay that much attention to it. But I'm speaking about this band first because it's the last one I have discovered. It's the latest one. It's been, I think, about 5 or 6 months that I have discovered this band, and I have been playing this album very frequently. The name of the band is Ponce Pilate, and it was released in 1985. It was self-released, released by the band themselves as well. As soon as I discovered this band, I immediately wanted to buy the album, but when I went to search for a copy, I noticed that there was never a vinyl repress of the album, and the original copies are quite expensive. They are sold for quite some money, so I think it will be quite some time before I can put my hands on a copy myself. When you listen to this album, and first of all, it's not an easy album to review at all because it has a very unique mix of styles, in the sense that it has like that dark 70s prog aura mixed with hard rock and heavy metal also. I think the music, you can hear some early Judas Priest in it, like from Rockarola and Sad Wings of Destiny to a certain extent. It has an epic feel to it as well. It's very mixed, but it creates that dark atmosphere. This is the album that resembles mostly that dark aura emanated by the Italian doom scene. This is the closest thing there is to that kind of sound. Even if you look at the cover art of the album, it also emanates that kind of vibe. The Judas Priest resemblance comes mainly on the track Violence et Fête d'Hiver. There's another track, Le Vierge de Fer, who has also an Iron Maiden feel to it, and even the intro you can immediately match it with Running Free from Iron Maiden. The use of keyboards over here add to that prog feeling as well, considering it's a band made from 2 musicians as well. One of the musicians takes care of most of the instruments, whilst the second musician is the drummer. This is that kind of album that I categorize as the type of album you listen alone in a room, in a dark lit room with your headphones on, and grabbing the album in your hands, looking at the cover art and letting your mind wander through the music. That's the kind of message I get from this album. It's not a headbanging album or a raise your fist kind of album. It's totally the other way around. That doesn't mean there aren't faster parts on this album. There are, but I don't think the whole essence of the album revolves around those parts. It revolves around that aura, that atmosphere it creates. In Queen is another highlight track over here, but if I had to choose my favorite, it would be La Cloche de l'Enfer. The guitar solo on this track is absolutely amazing. Not with regards to technicality, but regards to the amount of emotion there is in this track. And with guitar solos, that is what I look for, is the emotion, is the passion encapsulated in those notes being played. So next in line is one of the most consistent bands from the French metal scene, and I'm speaking about the band Killers. Wasn't sure from which album I was going to choose from this band. My favorite are their first 2 albums, but I decided to go for the second album of theirs, and which is titled Danger de Vie. It was released in 1986 with Sydney Productions. Compared to their first album, which was all out speed metal, this one is a bit more controlled, a bit more melodic, with better production, kind of similar to the difference between Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning from Metallica. Kill 'Em All was all out guns blazing, Ride the Lightning was a bit more controlled, but still contained that aggressivity of Kill 'Em All, and it's similar situation over here with these 2 albums. Killers have released an astounding 17 full-length albums, although from the 6th album onwards only one original member was present in the lineup, whereas the rest of the band moved on their own and formed another French heavy metal band called Titan. The tempo on this album is completely different than the previous one. This is fast speed metal. It is made for headbanging, for moshing, for raising your fist. Apart from the first track, which is a bit radio friendly, but the rest of the tracks are total heavy metal mayhem. After that opening track, a new track comes along, which is called Assassin, and I think this is the best track on the album. It has a slower start, but then catches up the tempo, and it's a really good track. And if you don't get the urge to mosh and headbang after you start hearing the riffing on this track, then maybe you have to question your heavy metal tastes a bit, because this is, once you hear these kind of riffs, I cannot stand still and just listen to it. I have to wear guitar or headbang or something like that. There's also an instrumental on this album which is called Parabellum, and again, this is a really good instrumental track as well. Instrumental track aside, the rough vocals on this album really complement the style of the band, and so you get that speed, that fast tempos with that rough vocals, with a great composition of the tracks. I mean, you have a classic heavy metal album right here. Next on the list is one of the first albums I bought with regards to French heavy metal bands, and I'm speaking about the album by H-Bomb titled Coup de Metal. It's actually an EP, so I'm making an exception here, but since this my first album, it's not the first, obviously it's not the first French heavy metal band I heard. That will come later on, but this is the first one I bought to add to my collection, so it's quite special to me, so I wanted to include it and promote it also on this video. It was released in 1983 with Raven Records. The sound is similar to the previous Killers album, up-tempo, heavy metal, same kind of influences, Motorhead, Judas Priest, new wave of British heavy metal, of course. Most of these bands, like the Scandinavian bands I mentioned in last week's episode, and if you haven't seen that, I'm putting a link up here, so click there and go watch it as well. These bands, most of them take influence from these major players in the game, like I mentioned earlier. It is one of those fun heavy metal albums, and if I had to choose a favorite track on here, it will be Condemned à Mort. So we have arrived to the fourth album. Let me have a sip here before I continue. Some French flavor to put me, and hopefully if you can grab a glass of wine, red wine as well, you can feel that French taste whilst we're speaking about French heavy metal. Next album on the list is by the band Warning, and the album is titled Warning 2, although it's not marked on the cover, but it's officially named Warning 2. It was released in 1982 by the London-based record label by the name of Polydor. For those who follow the history of record labels involved in heavy metal, Polydor is a big name in the industry with bands. They had signed bands such as Rainbow, Deep Purple, Yngwie Malmsteen, and Accept as well. So Warning was in the company of some legendary acts. Obviously Warning didn't reach that status, but this album merits an introduction in this list because it follows the style of the previous two albums, kind of the classic heavy metal coming out from those years. Motorhead, Judas Priest, the bands from the new wave of British heavy metal, Scorpions to a certain extent, so you get the idea of the sound as well on here, which follows the previous two albums. There's also a bit of a hard rockish feel on this album as well, kind of Crocus comes to mind, for example, that kind of sound. An interesting fact here is that the track titles are written in English, but actually the lyrics are all in French, and maybe that's one of the reasons why this band didn't make it internationally. Although, mind you, most of the bands on this list have lyrics in French, and as far as I'm concerned, that is the best option for these bands. Some of that added bonus as far as I'm concerned, even though I don't understand everything spoken in French, but it gives the tracks an identity associated with that particular country, with that particular particular culture, and anyone interested in linguistics knows that languages are a representation of a particular culture. Therefore, since I want to listen to something which is synonymous with a country which transmits those kind of emotions, most of the bands here who sing in French have, in my case, an added bonus. Although apparently to the majority of the people worldwide, singing in a language they don't understand is a negative aspect. Not for me. For me, and this counts also for other countries like, for example, Italy, I prefer Italian bands who sing in Italian because they can transmit, they can understand the lyrics more, they can make them more their own. The message comes to the listener more to the point, rather than singing in a language which is not really your mother tongue. Considering the label, this actually would have, and consider also that this has a sound which would appeal to a wider audience, it is strange how, with the backing of such a label, this album didn't make it to a bigger stage. The track Commando over here, which is my favorite track on this album, is highly influenced by the new wave of British heavy metal. Speed Moi is another highlight track on here. The first part of the album is more heavy metal, the second part tends to be a bit more hard rock, as I said, more hard rock, more blues based to a certain extent. And then it picks up the tempo again on the last track titled Planet Reverse, which is another highlight for me also from this album. Now we go back to a style similar to the first album I mentioned on this list, which I told you it's a kind of a strange album to review. And I have for you another album within those lines. And the album I'm speaking about is this one right here, which I have only on CD. And it's called Last, entitled Will Never Die. It was released in 1983 with Leslie Records. I'm quite sure that this album will not appeal to the majority of the people. For example, this band, I'm not surprised that they didn't make it big, because this is the kind of music that will appeal only to a few. I mean, when I say a few, it doesn't mean a dozen people, but it's not easy to get into this kind of music. You have to listen more times. It's not something that clicks with you immediately. The vocals are a bit strange. It's kind of a love or hate kind of vocals. I love the vocals on here, obviously that's why they are in this list. It's a kind of, and I said this in other lists I made many times, in heavy metal it's not about perfection, it's about how things can fit together to create a certain atmosphere, a certain kind of art which is unique in its own way, whilst respecting the values of heavy metal. It's an album, this one, that is revolved around the guitar solos, which are mind-blowing. I mean, they follow the music, the melody of the tracks so brilliantly, and they are put within a track. I mean, the composition here of the tracks is perfection. This band and this album reminds me a lot of Siritungol, for example. And like Siritungol, they have those great guitar solos within the tracks. Now the tracks within themselves, they are already great tracks, but when you put that guitar solo with that melody, it kind of pierces your heart with the sheer power it holds. Most of the times it isn't that easy to explain, but I'm really sensitive to this kind of music. It feels really personal. It also has an epic feel to it as well, and in some parts touches of Heavy Load or Gotham City from Sweden. These are two bands that I listed in last week's video titled Scandinavian Metal Essential Albums. So if you don't know those two bands, which are not that popular but aren't even unknown, go listen to that video and go listen to the bands first and foremost. My only problem with this album is the production. Considering the greatness of the music encapsulated in this album, if it had a better production, the overall product would have been much better. But needless to say, this is so good that even with a weaker production, it still reaches its target. It still delivers those emotions which are intended by the artist behind this album. My favorite track would be Waiting for That. This track is the one that really reminds me of Siritungol. I can almost hear Tim Baker singing on this track. The intro and the progression and the guitar solo. But this is something I can say about most of the tracks on here. And Too Young to Know is also a great track. Smoke on the Hills, the opening track. Listen to this album and let me know in the comments what you think about it. You might say this is rubbish, but I know people who adore this album, and if you tell them your favorite album from French heavy metal, they immediately say last. I don't think it is my favorite album from the French heavy metal scene, but it is definitely one of the best albums to come out of that country. Okay, so that's 5 albums down and 5 albums left on this list. Let me take another sip. And the next album in line is the album by the band High Power, named High Power. Released in 1983 by the famous French label Devil's Records, which has released a number of quality albums from French metal bands along the years. Obviously now the label doesn't exist anymore, but it's still renowned as one of the best, if not the best, French metal label, which helped bands from France to put out their music. The sound on this album is reminiscent of Judas Priest and Merciful Fate. In fact, the higher notes of the vocalist here remind me of the falsetto from King Diamond. Not really that high, but close enough. You will not find anything revolutionary on this album. It's a mid-tempo classic heavy metal album, but that is not to say that this album isn't special, because in fact it is, and it is amongst the top French heavy metal albums, and that makes it so because how the tracks are composed throughout the writing process. You have guitar riffs, guitar leads that adorn the track as a whole, piano parts, slower parts and faster parts, all this mixed and how they're put together. And this is obviously, I'm repeating myself from the previous album, because over here in these lists I'm speaking about the top of the iceberg, the ones that I really love. So most of the things are in common through these bands, but I cannot help but repeating myself to make justice to the greatness of these albums. Also on this album it is clear that the artists behind this record really took their time to build a dark atmosphere around the tracks. And this can clearly be seen, and mostly be seen, in the track Offrande Charnel, or Charnel, I'm not sure about the pronunciation. Translated in English, Carnel Offering, aptly titled, I must say, because the midsection part with the keyboards and the lamentations of the vocalist, it's like he's possessed by some kind of demon. It gives you the idea like a kind of an underground ritual is going on. And I really love when tracks give me these kind of feelings, because it's not always about headbanging, it's not all about moshing, or it is also about the atmosphere. Sometimes it moves with my mood at the time, but I'm always in the mood for these kind of vibes I get from these kind of tracks, and this album really does that job really well. All in all, there is a kind of balance here with the faster track like Chasse-toi or Cauchemar, and the darker tracks like Comme Damné. Think Beyond the Realms of Death by Judas Priest on this track, it's quite similar. And the previously mentioned Offrande Charnel, which are the kind of darker aura tracks within this album. So the balance is quite good, and it is retained quite brilliantly by the compositions of the tracks and the flow of the tracks in all the albums. So this is a landmark album in French heavy metal history. Entering now the Olympus of the French heavy metal scene, as far as I'm concerned, these next 4 albums are the albums which undoubtedly I have listened to the most from these bands in this list and from the whole French heavy metal scene in general. And next in line is the album Desir de Vampyr by Blaspheme, released in 1985 by Lizard Records. It's the second album by Blaspheme, and it is my favorite album from them. I think this is a better album in the sense that it is more mature, more cohesive. Each track has an identity, and it leans more towards heavy metal than the previous one, which was a bit more hard rockish. This album also has a very clear production. All the instruments have their own space to evolve. The opening track, Sol, is one of the best tracks also on this album. Mid-tempo heavy metal with a lot of melody. I think everything on here is perfect in a sense that you can enjoy this album from start to finish. All the tracks have a clear imprint, and I just love this album, and it gives me so much satisfaction to listen to it and almost sing along to the tracks, even though, as I said, I barely know French. When I saw Blaspheme live, I was singing the lyrics of the track, even though I wasn't sure I was pronouncing the right words, but it's more of the, I'm speaking here more of the sensation that it sends you, that it's a sing-along album and headbangable, a glass of wine in your hand, not beer, in case of French, I don't know. Maybe it's more pertinent to say wine in this case, but anyway, jokes apart, I mean, this is a really good album. Vocals are extremely good, on the cleaner side here, not so rough. As I said, most of the tracks are high tempo, mid tempo to high tempo, but there's one track that is a kind of a ballad, semi-ballad called Vivre Libre, which is my favorite track on this album. It's really emotional, it's really, even the lyrics when I translated them, they are really thought-provoking. I'm putting up some lyrics on the side here, a stanza from the lyrics of the tracks, which kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about in this particular track, because some people don't give enough attention to the lyrics, and most of the time the lyrics, they enhance the overall feel. So it's important that you at least have a basic idea of what you are listening to and what the subject that the artist is trying to portray in this track with both the lyrics and the music, even though I don't understand French, apart from the basic stuff, but I take the liberty to try and translate the tracks and understand of what the subject is all about. So there it goes, the 7th album on this list, Blaspheme, and the album Desir de Vampyr. 8th album now, and I'm going for a band which is amongst my all-time favorite bands from France and maybe even in general, and I'm speaking about the band ADX, and I have chosen the album La Terreur, released in 1985 by Sydney Productions, just like the Killers album I mentioned earlier in this list. ADX focus more on the speed, on the up-tempo in the music. This is almost at certain parts speed metal, but they don't forget their melodic touch also in order to make the album more interesting with more changes. ADX, their most prominent albums are the first 3 albums. This is the second one, and I went for this album because it is more balanced compared to fast up-tempo tracks and some mid-tempo tracks as well, whereas the other 2 albums are more focused on the speed. This one is focused both on the speed and on the melodic aspect as well, with some insertion of synths trying to create a darker atmosphere. This is aptly shown in the track Marquis de Mal, which is possibly my favorite track by ADX. The closing off of the track, apart the great guitar solo in this track, is a synth-based melody. It gives it a whole different level as far as I'm concerned. And these little touches is what makes the difference in an album, because you can be one of the many, but those little things make you stand out from the rest. Obviously, Marquis de Mal, when I heard it, it remained ingrained in my head more than other tracks. Another reason why I chose this album for this list. 2 favorite tracks on this album is Mémoire de l'Éternel and Tormented Passion, which has a fantastic bass intro, and then a lead guitar comes in and takes everything away, which is it's so brilliant, the interaction between these 2 instruments, especially on this track. So as I told you, this is amongst the top albums you will ever get to hear from the French metal scene. So if you don't know ADX in general, because ADX have been releasing albums up to this day, the last one was last year actually, and they had another one the previous year, so they're still very active. They are a very consistent band, always have great albums. I mean, none of their albums, as far as I can remember, is below average, so they deserve all the attention they can get. Two albums left. Those who have a slight idea of the French heavy metal scene will probably know one of the albums, at least from those that are left, because I obviously haven't mentioned it yet. The other album might be a bit of a surprise. Maybe those who know me will not be as much as a surprise for them, but I think in general people will be surprised by the album that I mentioned. But let's pass from the obvious choice here, possibly the most famous French 80s heavy metal band, and I'm speaking about Sortilege and the album Metamorphose, released in 1984, with Devil's Records as well. This is the first album by Sortilege. Before it there is the EP, which is really famous and has the self-titled track Sortilege, which is basically an anthem every time they play live, and they leave the track for the last moments because everyone knows the track. But this album followed up that EP and didn't disappoint at all. It's a magnificent album. Even the album after this was amazing as well, but I think this one is a bit better. Sortilege wrote very catchy tunes, highly melodic, obviously riff bass as well, mid-tempo, not really fast, not slow obviously, with the soaring vocals of Christian Augustin, who is a marvelous singer, and the higher notes reminds me of Rob Halford. The lyrics on this album, as most of the albums here, are in French, although Sortilege came up with the idea to re-record this album with English lyrics. Again, believe me, as I said before, when you hear these tracks in English, they lose half of their magic. In the end, it's just a language, but as I said before, when you are singing in your mother tongue, certain emotions in your singing come out much better because they come out naturally, not forced. If you want to check out this band, forget the English lyrics, forget the English albums, listen to the French albums. That is the real Sortilege. If I had to choose a favorite track on here, it will be the semi-ballad Délire d'une foi and the title track Metamorphose, which is the first track of Sortilege I ever heard. There's a video on YouTube. They did a video way back for that particular track. This is a definite go-to album with regards to French metal, no questions asked. Sortilege are a legendary band from that scene. They represented the scene so very well. Unfortunately, they weren't so successful, although outside of the French borders, they are undoubtedly the most famous band, but something held them from making it bigger. If I'm not mistaken, Sortilege was a favorite band of Chuck Schuldiner from Death. Either I read or I heard an interview where he mentioned them as one of his favorite bands at the time. So there it goes, one of the best albums you'll ever hear, Sortilege Metamorphose. So we have arrived to the last album, and this is possibly my favorite album from the French heavy metal scene ever, or at least the 80s heavy metal classic bands. And I'm speaking about the album Adrenaline by Voodoo Child. It was released in 1985 with Devil's Records as well, so there you go. 3 albums on this list with Devil's Records. That's how influential that label was at the time. So some years ago, actually a number of years ago, not a few, unfortunately time is passing really fast and it waits for no one, but anyway, I came across a track called Lucifer by a band named Voodoo Child, and I remember listening to that track and I was immediately hooked to it. I started listening to it over and over and over again. It happens to me a number of times, this kind of thing, when I get attached with a particular track and I cannot stop listening to it. So I went to search for the rest of the tracks from that particular album, and again I started playing the tracks over and over again, and I actually got obsessed with this album so much that I couldn't stop listening to it. There was no way I was listening to anything else apart from this album. When the occasion came to own a copy of this album, I was so obsessed that I didn't only buy the vinyl record, which I always do. My first preference is always vinyl. But with regards to this album, I ended up buying even the cassette and even the CD. And eventually even the t-shirt. So this was the first album I have ever owned on these 3 formats, all in at the same time. Up to this day I have I think about 3 or 4 other albums which I have the 3 of them, but this was the first one. I'm not that kind of a completionist kind of collector, which I want a particular album to close the collection, like close a discography. I'm not that kind of person. I buy the albums which I like and that's it. If I don't like an album, I don't buy it. But for some reason I wanted the whole parcel, the whole package of this album. It really, it being very underrated, it's kind of I made it my own to a certain extent. And again, up until to this day, I never get tired of this album. I play it a lot in my car. When I want to search for something, I don't know what to put. Okay, put Voodoo Child on, and I'm happy every time. Whatever my mood is, this album is that good. Every track is great, and if I had to mention one particular track, again, it's a kind of a slower track named Je ne veux pas devenir vieux, which translated should read something like I don't want to grow old. And the track is very emotional, even considering the title. It's so good. It's impressive. I mean, there's nothing complicated in this album. It's pretty straightforward, but it's really packed with quality. I mean, sometimes simplicity equals quality. If you try to overcomplicate things, you lose all that essence which I love about heavy metal. Most of the times, not every time, but most of the time. Anyway, other tracks like Destin, Toi, Cite is another great track, but all of them are great tracks. There's an instrumental on here which is called Ballad pour Adrenaline. I'm still amazed how underrated, how unknown this album is, because this was released with No Remorse Records, which is quite a renowned label, and there's still a lack kind of people who have followed this band. I don't know, maybe it's something that I caught on only me, but I don't know. If I had to choose one album from the French heavy metal scene, although Sortilege, Metamorphose is very close, but again, if I had to choose, I think I would choose this one. So there you go, those were the 10 albums I had for you today from the French heavy metal 80s scene. Keep in mind, as I always say, these are the tip of the iceberg. There are loads of other albums, loads of other bands which you can listen to, so use this video to kickstart your interest in these bands and go search for more albums and more bands for yourself, because obviously that's the beauty of heavy metal, to search and find albums like I did on most of the albums on this list. In the words of the illustrious King Lemmy, the chase is better than the catch most of the time. So I guess that is all for me. If you like this content, please, it would be appreciated if you could subscribe, like and share the content. There are descriptions and links to the albums I mentioned in the description underneath. There are also affiliate links for you to follow and buy the albums. Keep in mind, affiliate links are links from which we get a commission, but there will be no extra expense for you when you buy them. So you buy them from the links or not, you will pay the same price. It's just that if you follow from the links, we get a very small commission ourselves. So that is all. I hope you like the content, and until the next episode, stay safe and metal on. Cheers.